All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here with us today. This is the first part of a three-part mini-series that we're doing about the state of homelessness and what you need to know about it. My name is Daniel. I work on the research team at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The National Alliance is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization committed to preventing and ending homelessness in the United States. And I really love my work because I get to use research and data to advance goals that I really don't think are controversial. They're goals that everybody wants to see in their communities. We really help to identify and support policies and programs and practices that can ensure that everyone has a safe, stable place to live, which I think is a pretty great goal. Before we do get started, I want to just give my colleague Andrew a chance to introduce himself and share a few housekeeping notes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Hall. I'm a research analyst at the Alliance. I use he, him pronouns. It's great to be sharing this space with you. So I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So first, the Alliance strives to create an inclusive space that welcomes diverse voices and opinions. Discriminatory or abusive language or behavior that puts people at risk is not tolerated. The chat will not be open, but please do let us know if you feel unsafe for any reason. A member of our staff will monitor the Q&A, that will be me, and we'll leave time at the end to address as many of your questions as we have time for. Additionally, we just want to let you know that the webinar will be recorded and we will be sharing that and the presentation slides afterwards. If you want to follow up on anything that we say or any follow-up questions, or if we don't end up having time at the end for your questions, please reach out to us. And now I'll kick it back to Daniel.
Thanks, Andrew. So we're just going to dive right in so that we have plenty of time at the end for any questions that pop up over the course of the webinar. And, sometimes in conversations that we have, sometimes there's some confusion about what causes homelessness. We often hear that it's a personal issue or an individual problem, but we know from research, from folks who have dedicated their lives, their careers to this topic, data from reliable sources like the US Census and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and even from national surveys that we conduct, none of this data and evidence really supports the conclusion that homelessness is an individual problem. Rather, people experience homelessness for a few fundamental reasons that I think will resonate with a lot of people. First, and like I said, probably will resonate, I don't need to tell many people this, the rent is just too high. So we have a couple of visualizations here that help depict this. On the left, we see that in every state, minimum wage is not enough to pay for the cost of housing. We also see that there is really a gap between what an affordable rent would be for an extremely low-income worker, for someone making a low income, and what the median rent is across states. And this issue is increasingly impacting middle and upper middle class communities. Households that could previously afford housing really can no longer do so. And again, academic researchers who have spent decades studying homelessness have also found clear associations between high housing costs and homelessness. They help show us that when housing costs are high, people tend to experience homelessness at higher rates. So they've compared similar communities and show a clear association between these two trends, high housing costs and homelessness, using rigorous and trustworthy methods. At the same time, they really find that there's no association between other factors that are arbitrary, like weather and homelessness. And the visualization on the right offers a depiction of what their conclusion is. Homelessness is a housing problem. If you want to explore either of these visualizations or any of the resources that we provide here any further, Andrew's going to add a number of links to the chat, so please take a look, as many of our visualizations are actually interactive, and you can see specifically what's happening in your state and community. In addition to identifying the scale and scope of need in this webinar and in our second webinar, the third webinar will discuss how you can use these and other resources to help end homelessness in the United States and in your community. And it's really important to note here that this is not just a big city problem. People are struggling across geographies with high housing costs. While the cost of housing is growing fastest in a handful of particular cities, rental costs are increasing in almost every state and territory. In other words, people pretty much everywhere are feeling the pinch. And this isn't surprising when we look at rental trends across states. We see that rental housing is developing uh, pretty quickly, but not in a way that is accessible to middle and low income Americans. In fact, the number of affordable units is decreasing in part because affordable units are not being built or preserved at a pace that is necessary for all the families and individuals who need them. The private market has a growing number of expensive rental properties, but we see stagnant and even shrinking numbers of affordable ones. And this is all data from the US Census. And while it's super important that that there is not enough deeply affordable housing and that it's not being developed or preserved quickly enough, at the same time, this isn't the full story, right? Incomes are also not keeping up with housing costs. From weekly paychecks to Social Security incomes for older adults and people with disabilities, wages are too low to afford housing, which is another really prominent issue. Household budgets are not adding up. Incomes are not sufficient to pay for housing. Again, this is probably not something that I need to say too many times, but we want to reiterate some of these real experiences that people are facing in their own lives in ways that resonate with the data. So as a result of these issues, we see that tens of millions of Americans dispersed across every state pay 30 or even 50% of their incomes on rent. This is what we call cost burden and severe housing cost burdens. This means that people have less money to pay for other important needs like food and clothing, and that from 2019 to 2024, the amount of income that households have left after paying for all of their housing and rental expenses, they have even less money left to pay for their necessary expenses. This number that they have left is declined dramatically, from 2019 to 2023. So this visual that I've pulled up on the screen actually focuses on a small subset of this population. And that population that we focus on are people living in poverty. These households are the most at risk of homelessness because they have low incomes and they are forced to pay too much of their low incomes on housing. To avoid homelessness, many of these households double up, which means that they stay with a family or a friend in overcrowded environments. And they really are doing this out of financial necessity, which is an important caveat. In other words, the methods that we use really try and identify those folks who have low incomes and who are living in a doubled up situation because they just don't have any other option. Rising housing costs and stagnant incomes are making it hard for people across the board to pay their bills. But bad policies and struggling systems make it even harder for some people to find a safe, stable, and affordable home. In some states, people can be served an eviction notice and removed from housing in a number of weeks after a missed payment, giving them no time to prepare their families and their loved ones to find a new place to stay. Meanwhile, people with an eviction or a criminal record may have trouble finding a landlord who's willing to rent to them or an employer who's willing to hire them. These groups will have a harder time affording housing on the private market, with some estimates showing people with a legal record experiencing homelessness at 10 times the rate of the general population. It should also be shocking that nearly 1 in 3 foster youth will experience homelessness during their lifetimes. And I don't think anyone really needs a reminder that the costs of routine healthcare continue to rise and be increasingly out of reach. Tens of millions of Americans rely on subsidized healthcare to help pay for their doctor bills, but these subsidies are just often not enough. There's also a shortage of facilities for people in need. Expensive and hard to access facilities means that people who may need behavioral health care, physical health care, just can't access it. And many of us are one emergency bill or one crisis away from homelessness. At the same time, many people are also who are enter homelessness are also survivors of intimate partner violence, with the data showing that people who have survived intimate partner violence are much more likely to experience homelessness. Once homeless, many of these health and other challenges become even more difficult to address, which just prolongs homelessness and causes more harm to the individual and increasing costs for communities that they live in. As I will share later, many of these challenges are absolutely not inevitable. Policies and practices offer real solutions, but require dedicated members of the public to demand these solutions from their elected leaders. So our second webinar will really dive into who experiences homelessness, but this conversation about the causes of homelessness is not complete, and it's certainly not accurate if it does not identify how the housing crisis has a disproportionate impact on specific groups. For many years, policies made it legal to, among many other things, deny housing on the basis of race. Laws allowed the government and private citizens to take land and property from indigenous communities. Bad policies caused Black people to be incarcerated at higher rates, and people of color continue to face discrimination in housing and employment. They pay higher rents and have lower incomes relative to the overall population. Black households are also more likely to be denied housing in the private market, despite being equally qualified as their white counterparts. And the simple truth is that despite the dedicated work of nonprofits, local governments, service providers, there's just not enough resources in the homeless response system to serve everyone who is in need. And without enough resources, people facing some of the greatest barriers, those who are excluded and discriminated against, will bear the greatest burdens of homelessness and housing insecurity. So I'll just pause and acknowledge here that there's a lot more nuance about who experiences homelessness and the trends that we see in homelessness nationally, at the state level, in your communities locally. And we're going to try and explore those trends in greater detail in our next webinar, which will really identify demographic and geographic trends in homelessness. And I also want to acknowledge that these challenges are stark. I'll be the first to admit that sometimes they feel really overwhelming. For many, these challenges probably feel pretty close to home, pretty similar to some of your own experiences, maybe. And homelessness, even if you have not faced these challenges in your own life, is personal. Many of us in our own communities see our neighbors struggling to access housing every single day. And housing insecurity hurts local economies, makes it more difficult for people to thrive and contribute to their communities. So really what I'm trying to say is that this is an urgent challenge that impacts all of us. While understanding these causes is absolutely necessary to ending homelessness, it's not enough. Knowing the causes must also contribute to more effective solutions. So as I alluded to before, this is where we kind of leave off this conversation and where we lead into our next two conversations. And we really hope that you can join us, because I think it's an important and really critical part. There is good news. We don't want to just say that there's a bunch of problems and leave it there, like I was alluding to before. We not only know the causes of homelessness, but we also know how to end it. We have data about who is experiencing homelessness and what it takes to connect these folks with the housing, income, and resources they need to build prosperous and safe communities that are stable and prosperous for everyone. We need to ensure that people have access to the robust support and resources that they need. Communities across geographies and groups from a variety of backgrounds need access to resources. Policymakers play a really important role here, and they need to know who experiences homelessness, as we'll discuss in webinar 2, why people experience homelessness, as we discussed today, and what they can do as our elected officials to ensure everyone has a place to call home, which we will discuss in webinar 3. We'll talk about these topics more, and our hope is really to equip you with the knowledge and data and resources that we all need to play a role in pushing for national solutions and also for supporting those solutions that are in our backyard. If you're not already registered, please check out the links in the chat that Andrew will have shared. And with that, I think I've left a good amount of time, at least 10 minutes or so for questions. So if there are any, I'll let my colleague Andrew here jump in since he's been monitoring the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. So just to one more piece of information I'll share is that everything that we're talking about here is based on our plethora of research and our annual State of Homelessness report, which uses publicly available data from the census and HUD. And then, and of course, also other data that we collect came from interviews and focus groups across our other projects. So yes, thank you for that. And I'll start taking questions. I'm looking at the Q&A and it looks like some people have already started putting in questions.
Hey, Andrew, can I jump in just to mention there was a question about whether or not the slides will be emailed out and shared. We are recording this webinar and we will share that after the presentation. It should also be posted on our website, but we will confirm. I also saw a question, a really great question about how we refer to people experiencing homelessness. Someone mentioned that they've heard the term unhoused before, if one is correct or if there's any difference between the two. We try and use person first language at the Alliance, which means that we're referring to the individual and not to the experience of homelessness when we talk about them. We know that there are ways for people to re-enter housing and live stable lives in permanent housing, which is why we use the term people experiencing homelessness rather than homeless people. At the same time, I think that people can tell when we're using language that is respectful and really focused on the individual in front of us rather than derogatory. And so I think unhoused is equally respectful and appropriate to use. Thanks for that question. There's also a question in the chat about research or in the Q&A about research and efforts to distribute data and help people stay informed about this topic, especially in light of some of the current context and efforts to get rid of research and data, especially at the national level. One of the things that I will mention is that a lot of the data that we use comes from the annual homelessness assessment report, which is an annual report mandated under statutory requirements for HUD to produce and send to Congress each year about homelessness in the United States. So one of the really incredible things about that data is that it's largely reliant on local communities to go out, interact with people experiencing homelessness, and count who is experiencing homelessness in your communities. Um, those counts generally take place in January at a minimum, and then oftentimes communities will host them throughout the year to get a better and more accurate count. That's something that you can get involved with, and oftentimes is a volunteer effort. And so, um, like I said, we rely on that data to do analyses like this. And it's really important for us to know who's experiencing homelessness, as we'll discuss next week, in order to address it. So if that's something that sounds that you're passionate about and sounds interesting, we encourage you to get involved. There's also a question about how climate change and natural disasters impact homelessness and how that might change in the next decade. It's a really great question, and certainly something that we are seeing as more and more of an issue. We saw large increases in homelessness in places like Hawaii after the devastating fires there, and in other places after extreme weather events. Um, so it's certainly an issue. We also know that people who are living in unhoused situations are far more at risk of injury and harm as a result of extreme weather events. And so communities put a lot of effort and resources into trying to keep people safe during those events. But oftentimes the guidance is, stay inside, close your doors, board up your windows. But for our neighbors experiencing homelessness, that's not possible, which is why we really need to advocate and identify those folks who are in need and make sure that they can have access to safe places to live, so that they are not at such severe risk of natural disasters. Great question. Thank you. There's also a question here about how do you see the role of housing policies and not in my backyard policies changing nationally and locally? What can COCs do about changing these policies to increase affordable and low income housing? That's a great question, and one that I think we'll address a little bit more in detail in our third webinar, but I'll just briefly say that I think a lot of communities are recognizing and becoming frustrated by the fact that it's just really hard to build things like permanent housing that is affordable to people with the lowest incomes. Um, COCs in the past have been sort of charged by HUD with trying to advocate for and really push for more inclusive zoning policies and affordable housing development policies. We also know, that COCs have a lot on their plates already to serve people experiencing homelessness with the greatest needs. And so it really needs to be something that members of the public are pushing for and saying, like, we need more affordable housing. We need this problem to be addressed through more inclusive policies and programs for people with lower incomes, to ensure that they have access to permanent housing. So we'll have more of a discussion on this in our third webinar, but we really need, members of the public, all of you all, to get involved and make that heard both locally and at the federal level.
We also have a question about sharing salient research on this and what our efforts are to distribute data and keep people informed and raising awareness. The Alliance is working with our national partners and working with our partners across different sectors and industries. And we are advocating on the Hill and leveraging all of the support and work of you all and our partners on the local and state levels to do also, help out in that dissemination work. In addition to our state of homelessness report, which can be used as fact sheets, the Alliance also helps put out community level and state level fact sheets that people can use on the ground. We also have a suite of different advocacy alerts, and I can share a link to that in our chat, as other opportunities to get involved and communicate with your lawmakers using data and information from the local level on what people should be doing and what you're seeing. So thank you very much for that question.
Hmm. There is a question about maybe narratives, false narratives that people experiencing homelessness are not, contributing economically to their communities, or taking advantage of public support without really contributing anything back. What data or narratives can help correct this misconception and promote a more accurate understanding of their economic participation? That's a really great question. There's a few studies that we cite in our state of homelessness report. Um, I'm not going to be able to pull them up super quickly, but maybe it's something we can share down the road, that point to just how many people experiencing homelessness are working. I think it's uh, and or receiving income, and it's or right around like 50%. It's a national study, and I think that those numbers indicate even higher numbers locally in some studies, like the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. I also think local data is really important here. We see, with the point in time counts, that sometimes communities will add in additional questions of people experiencing homelessness to add a more nuanced picture to those questions that are required at the federal level. And from what I see from those counts, oftentimes people are working, making low wages, maybe sleeping in their car and other places, just trying to make ends meet, but just can't afford the staggering costs. So I think some of those local sources of data are important in addition to the larger studies that I've referenced. I also think sharing lived experiences of people experiencing homelessness is really important. When you talk with people who are experiencing homelessness and talk about their needs, we often hear, that the cost of living is just far exceeding people's incomes, and really that lies at the root of the issue. Um, we are at about time, so I'm just gonna take a sec to thank you all again for being here with us today. These are intended to be just quick, snapshots of the work that we're doing and the research that we use in our work, to help paint a more complete picture for you all about homelessness in the United States. We're really excited again to dive into who experiences homelessness, the trends that we're seeing in the second part of this webinar series, as well as what you can do to advance solutions that we know help to end homelessness at the national and the local level. Um, Thanks again for all of your awesome questions. This was really wonderful to respond to, and we'll really look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a good one. Thanks again.